I want to love Resident Evil Revelations, mainly because of the time that it was made in, when the Resident Evil franchise was firmly planting its roots in the potent and profitable action-adventure soil. Revelations decided it was going to attempt to make a horror game in that environment. The main franchise would eventually go back to horror itself, and Revelations was no longer needed. But the idea of a spin-off series trying to carry the original design philosophy through was something that really intrigued me on first glance. But I don't really love Resident Evil Revelations. I don't think it's a bad game. It's actually quite competent, and in some areas it's even impressive. The atmosphere of the ship setting is well done. One of the scariest places you can be is out in the open ocean, all alone. Throw mutated monsters into the mix and you have yourself a good time. The structure is also similar to previous Resident Evil games. It doesn't have the fixed camera style, but we are getting keys and backtracking to different rooms to unlock new areas. For brief spots, it feels like a true Resident Evil title. But Revelations can't quite help itself. It has to dip its toe into the action genre as well. The game takes us away from these horror moments to focus on other things, either in the past or parallel to the main plot of the game. These sequences are usually faster-paced, linear sections that put the emphasis on the escape. Hordes of enemies cut down by your assault rifle-shaped scythe. These moments tend to take away from the horror that the game is trying to push. Its story is somewhat convoluted. Though interesting, it is, just like its genre, all over the place. It makes similar mistakes to that of Resident Evil 6, introducing too many characters that mostly don't have an effect on the player. They might have some surface-level effect on the plot, they may advance characters or events forward, but they don't really speak to the person playing the game. Revelations is a bit like a Frankensteinian monster. There are bits of this thing that work, appendages and patches of flesh that still pump blood, and if struck, would manage to recover in a matter of days. But the other parts are rotting and falling apart. Hit them with a blunt object and they'd be sure to explode in a rain of blood and viscera. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll be diving deep into Resident Evil Revelations, talking about gameplay, mechanics, story, and every piece of functioning flesh in between. If you haven't seen my previous videos on the Resident Evil series, I'd highly recommend checking them out now. It's not mandatory, but it will provide a lot of necessary development and design context for where the series has come from. If you enjoy this video, consider supporting the channel over on Patreon. I've been reviewing the Resident Evil movies over there, and it's been a great time. So if you want to see me torture myself by watching bad films, head to the link in the description. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Resident Evil Revelations. If you're watching this channel, then odds are you're probably a fan of Remedy games, or at least the Alan Wake series. I've made tons of videos on their projects in the past, and today I'm here to talk about something new. Lost in Cult, the company behind premium high-end deep dive books on games like The Outer Wilds, Animal Well, and the newly released Immortality Design Works, has launched its biggest collaboration yet, the Alan Wake Design Works book made in collaboration with Remedy Entertainment. It's more than just an art book, it's a deep dive into the series covering Alan Wake 1, 2, and even American Nightmare. There's new insights, development stories, concept art, and extensive developer interviews with Sam Lake, Mikhail Kasurinen, Ilka Vili, and Matthew Peretta. The list goes on and on. The deluxe edition of the book, which is only available during the pre-order campaign from August 18th to October 17th, comes with a exclusive foil block clamshell presentation box, the hardback book in a translucent wrap, a dust jacket based on the in-game return manuscript, and a treasure trove of extras. There's a ton of stuff with this deluxe edition. A Coffee World poster, an Oh Dear Diner designer napkin, crime scene Polaroids, bookmarks, postcards, a full Bright Falls fold-out map, and a card signed by actors Matthew Peretta and Ilka Villi. That's both halves of Alan Wake himself right there. Perhaps the thing I'm most excited for is the full manuscript of Return, fully in print for the first time. If you're watching this after the campaign has closed on October 17th, or you just want the standard edition of the book by itself, that version will remain available, but be quick on the deluxe edition. I honestly love stuff like this. I'm a huge fan of physical media, and just having these things in like a nice hardcover book that you can pull out and flip through is awesome. Lost in Cult's previous works as well are incredibly high quality, and they're all like must-haves. If you like this channel and deep dives into games in general, then you have to check this out. Also, Alan Wake feels like the best series for a thing like this because it's so tuned into the fine details. Like everything really matters, and I feel like you're going to get a lot of that with this. So show your support to the company and support the channel by using the code YourFaveSonAlan at lostincult.co.uk. Or just use the link in the description to get 5% off this brand new Alan Wake collection, or anything from their amazing store right now. Now back to the video. Resident Evil Revelations began development sometime around 2010. The basic idea for the game was to bring the series back to its horror roots. Jun Takeuchi, a mainstay staff member for the Resident Evil series, was actually the one to come up with the original concept. What if, for this title, we set it on a boat? Kawada recalled Takeuchi saying. Seeing it on a cruise ship, we'd be able to set it in a nice, scary atmosphere, similar to the original game. After Resident Evil 4 and 5 had been released, though they were successful, certain fans were more interested in the series when it was firmly planted in the survival horror genre. Since it had shifted to action, a lot of fans were clamoring for that lost style. The setting of a cruise ship was meant to create a constricted and scary atmosphere. Small hallways and tight corridors meant that the series would be moving away from the open areas of games like RE4 and 5. This was also an idea originally posed for Resident Evil 3 when it was still in a developmental flux. But RE Revelations was developed for the 3DS, and it was meant to be a 3DS game from the start. Since the team was making a game for the handheld market, they wanted to ensure that they brought high-fidelity graphics, a terrifying scenario, and good gameplay to the fans. They made a point of not thinking of Revelations as just a handheld game. But Masachika Kawada, producer on Revelations, was adamant that there was an art to portable games, rather than just being a cash grab or a way to get more entries out of a franchise. He specifically cited the fact that Japanese design had many cultural tricks to make things more efficient. We tend to take pride in the fact, at least we think, that we have some skill in being able to pack this variety of elements that hopefully people can really enjoy in this satisfactory and pretty way into a very small package. The same goes for developing games onto portable hardware. This was specifically in reference to the art of Makonuchi Bento, the small Japanese boxes stored with lunch food made to be portable. He also referenced nimosaki, or double cropping, which is the practice of cultivating two crops on the same land within different time periods in the year. How does this relate to the development of Resident Evil Revelations, you ask? Well, the team was designing Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D for the 3DS right before Revelations. They developed essentially two games for the same system, one after the other, using a lot of the same tech. Mercenaries 3D actually allowed them to get used to the 3DS hardware and iron out a lot of the issues that they had. Revelations was developed on MT Framework, the engine that was the precursor to the RE engine, but a lot of work had to be done to port the system for use in the handheld device. Developing the game for the 3DS also meant that the team needed to find a way to make the game easily digestible for playing portably in small chunks. Handheld players didn't tend to play for long, extended periods, so the team decided to give the game an episodic structure, not dissimilar to a TV show. Because of this episodic structure, they had to rethink the characters though and try to include some characters that they wouldn't have originally considered for an RE game. The game was eventually revealed at E3 2010. Resident Evil Revelations was released on January 26, 2012 in Japan, January 27, 2012 in Europe, and February 7, 2012 in North America, all for the Nintendo 3DS. The game was also released the next year on Windows, PS3, Wii U, and Xbox 360, and would be ported to next-gen consoles in 2017. I actually played the PC version of the game for this review. It's not drastically different from the original version of the game, aside from the fact that in the 3DS version, you can control the menus with the bottom screen. There is some additional content in the PC and console versions, mostly in that of extra weapons and outfits, but it's mostly the same game. Since Resident Evil 4 and 5 had taken a shift more towards action, Resident Evil Revelations represents a return to horror for the series. Of course, a few things in this game go against this design ideology. There will be points where the game descends into large action set pieces, but it's more rare than the moments where the game favors atmosphere and tension. Despite this, the game sports a third-person over-the-shoulder camera. Of course, like many other games in the series, our resources are restricted. We only get ammunition from the environment. We use healing herbs to refill our health bar, though we no longer combine them to create greater strengths or different effects. An interesting note about the gameplay for Revelations is that it is one of the first games in the series to feature the ability to shoot and move at the same time. Technically, the first game to allow you to do this was Outbreak File Number 2, but we'll talk about that game in a different video. This choice was a big one at the time, especially because fans of the series had been hoping that the mainline entries would give them this ability. This was an issue with Resident Evil 5 when it was originally revealed, but Revelations decided to include the feature right out of the gate. This was a hard decision for the team because they felt moving and shooting would reduce some of the horror that the game presented. They got around this by decreasing the player's movement speed a bit and increasing the movement of the enemies, giving them the ability to dodge shots more often. This was a way to offset the action byproduct that was created from the gameplay change. This works pretty well in Revelations' case, especially since we have the over-the-shoulder camera and the closer, more confined environment of the ship. The game is horror-focused for the most part, though. We will spend a lot of our time aboard the Queen Zenobia cruise ship. Moving through its hallways, we'll often be greeted by the sounds of enemies around the corner, waiting to attack. The atmosphere is really well done in this entry, and I did often find it scary when it was trying to be. The structure of the game in general really feels like the classic Resident Evil games, just without the fixed camera. A lot of the game is about solving puzzles or grabbing key items and unlocking new areas of the ship. The game expands its scope in some different areas that weren't my favorite, but we'll talk about those when we get to the story. We are outfitted with a variety of weapons across the course of the story, but inventory management is a little different in this game than it was in previous entries. We can carry as many items as we want. The only thing that we're really restricted on are our weapons. We can only carry 3 weapons at a time, but thankfully, if we pick up a new weapon, then we can obtain it, or our old one, at any time from an item box. Item boxes are no longer for storing extra key items, healing items, etc. It's more singularly focused on weapons. While we can switch out weapons in item boxes, we can also upgrade them here. Upgrading weapons requires custom parts, which can be found in a variety of different ways throughout the game. We can get them from defeating particularly difficult enemies, or we can find them hidden in the environment. The custom parts all have a different attribute, and they can be equipped to the weapon to add that modifier. These can increase our damage, fire rate, or magazine capacity, among many other things. I actually really liked this system and felt that it was a good way to provide progression in lieu of the treasure system or general weapon upgrades that something like Resident Evil 4 had. It provides good rewards for those that are actively exploring the environment and trying to get into the optional areas of the ship. For the most part, it also lets you customize your weapons the way you want and tailor your playthrough to your style. Combat in general is pretty much the same as any of the other over-the-shoulder Resident Evil games of this time. We can shoot enemies, targeting their head or weak spot to do more damage. We can do melee attacks if we manage to stun enemies and get close enough, dealing big damage and also saving us valuable ammunition. I think for the most part, I thought that the combat was pretty smooth in this game. There were some complaints that the characters move a little slow, which is valid because I noticed this when playing the game as well. But in all fairness, if we moved any faster, the game would probably be far too simple, and it would reduce a lot of the horror that the game presents. A lot of the horror in this game comes from the fact that we can't just run away quickly, and missing a shot means that we're losing distance between us and the enemy. The game also sports a new dodge feature, allowing you to time a button press with an enemy's attack to slip out of the way of their swipes. I'm not sure if this was just the PC version of the game, but I absolutely could not get this to work. I saw some other people online talk about similar issues, but it was just so random. Part of the issue is that the dodge key is mapped to the W key, meaning that we have to move forward into the dodge to pull it off. But I found so many moments where I accidentally dodged when I wasn't trying to, or moments when I didn't dodge and I was trying to. The other large new system that Revelations introduces is the Genesis scanner. We get this piece of equipment pretty early on in the game. It's a new device that the BSAA has developed to collect data. We can use it on enemies or the pools left by their dead corpses to increase our analyze meter. When we manage to fill this, we get a free healing item. You are encouraged to scan as many enemies as you possibly can because you're getting free items, so why wouldn't you? You can also use the device to search for hidden objects in the environment. These items are ones that you wouldn't be able to pick up otherwise. Again, this is sort of another way to reward players with a more patient and detail-focused playstyle to get more resources. I really like this mechanic in theory, but in the actual game it has a lot of issues. Because you get so many rewards for using it, you sort of have to. You don't have to, but there are just so many hidden items in every room that it behooves you to look for them. If you skip this step, then you're just leaving perfectly good items behind for no reason. But having to stop in every single room to scan the area for hidden items, or even stopping every time that you kill an enemy to get the analysis data, just really kills the pacing in some parts. It takes you out of the world and teleports you into this detective scanner plane that honestly doesn't tonally mesh very well with this entry. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if it was used for some story beats. Maybe we need to track a blood trail through the ship and have to use it at different intersections to figure out where to go. That would be nice because the scanner wouldn't be present so much, and it would effectively be a story mechanic only. Because we're sort of forced into it to get more ammo and healing though, it's present for much of the game and just feels like it gets in the way. I don't mind the mechanic in general, I just think it would have worked better in a different game. In Resident Evil Revelations, we'll also often be accompanied by a partner. These partners change as we play a lot of different characters and combinations of those characters throughout the course of the game. But this is by far the simplest implementation of an AI companion in the series so far. We don't really have to worry about the companion dying or providing them with resources. They also don't take resources from the environment. They're just sort of there to help us defeat enemies. They are somewhat okay. They will often just stand there and fire shots at enemies, which is exactly what they should do. Every once in a while, though, they'll get stuck on some part of the environment and just sort of walk for infinity. It's pretty rare, though, and honestly, the lack of problems with the partner AI is pretty shocking, especially considering the level of fidelity that the game has on a handheld console. Overall, the gameplay for Revelations is pretty good. The combat system feels smooth, most of the ship-focused sections are full of tension and fear, the atmosphere is very well done, and environments look really good. I actually enjoyed a lot of the fake items in the game, the drink dispensers and vending machines, the slots in the casino. The game has some pretty great lighting as well for something that was originally on the 3DS. But now it's about time that we talk about the story of Revelations. The game begins at 6:08 p.m. on the Mediterranean Sea. Jill is on a small skiff heading through the waves towards the much larger Queen Zenobia. She has a companion with her, a new character that we'll learn more about later. His name is Parker Luciani. Resident Evil Revelations actually takes place in between Resident Evil 4 and 5, so Jill and Chris haven't quite yet had their traumatic experience at the Spencer estate. As our two characters reach the ship, they find a grappling point and board the boat. They are looking for Chris and Jessica. They were out completing a mission for the BSAA when they dropped off the radar, and their last known coordinates put them on this ship. Making our way into the ship, we immediately see signs of trouble. Bodies litter the halls, and an ooze is pouring out of the ducts. A body quickly pops out of the vents. Whatever happened here, we're far too late to save any of the victims. Jill and Parker quickly find a grate, and Jill notices a weapon among the muck. As she reaches down to grab it, she realizes that it's attached to a hand. Luckily, it isn't Chris's arm, but we quickly see the group is being watched, and an enemy attacks. This is our first foe of the game, the ooze. While I don't like the name, I don't really mind the design of the ooze. They are infected, just like any other Resident Evil fodder monster, but they're sort of bloated and waterlogged. It feels like these enemies fit with the ship theme and mesh with the environment that we're currently in. They use general swiping attacks to try and hit us, but they sway back and forth quite a bit, making headshots difficult to pull off. I often just resigned myself to shooting the body in a panic because the enemy was closing distance and I definitely didn't want to get hit. Jill and Parker take out this monster and realize that the situation aboard the ship is worse than they could have imagined. This ends the first chapter of the game. Resident Evil Revelations, as I said before, has an episodic structure, lending itself to handheld play in short bursts rather than the longer play sessions. I actually really enjoyed this structure. There are even recaps in between each full episode that bring you up to speed in case it's been a while since you played. It reminded me of something like Alan Wake, and how the game attempts to actually feel like a season of a TV show. One thing that I didn't like is that the episodes are further broken into chapters. These chapters are far shorter and require you to interact with an end screen in between each one of them, allowing you to save if you'd like. It just breaks up the game a bit too much for my liking. I would have preferred if we got this screen only when the episode was finished, but again, this probably would have went against the design philosophies that the team had in mind. From here on out, I will note the end of episodes, but not the end of chapters, because they just come far too frequent. The next chapter begins with a news report that sort of sets up the backstory of the game. The newscaster is presenting a sort of retrospective report on the city of Terra Grigia, the world's first aquapolis and floating city. The city itself was incredibly futuristic, covered in solar panels and fully harnessing the energy of our nearest star. A satellite in the sky would even reflect the sunlight back to the city. In 2004, this all ended when a terrorist group called Veltro, who opposed the development of the city, released a virus upon its citizens, in addition to many BOWs. These weapons caused havoc throughout the streets, absolutely obliterating its population. The FBC was called in to deal with the situation. The FBC is not the Federal Bureau of Control, but the Federal Bioterrorism Commission. They are specifically American anti-bioterrorism organizations, whereas the BSAA is an organization sanctioned by the UN. The BSAA was brought in to assist the FBC. Headquarters eventually decided that the only way to deal with the situation was to use the solar energy matrix on the city, turning the satellite in space into a massive weapon that leveled Terra Grigia. The event is now known as the Terra Grigia Panic. This was officially the end of the terrorist group called Veltro. Revelations takes place a year later, in 2005, and the Terra Grigia Panic is sort of the foundation or bedrock that the story takes place on. The news broadcast then cuts off, and the story cuts back a few days to Jill and Parker meeting with Clive O'Brien, the head of the BSAA. They're on the same beach outside of where the now sunken city of Terra Grigia lays. Strange carcasses have begun washing up on the shore. We're introduced to the Genesis here, the new device that allows us to scan life forms and items. We're tasked with scanning these strange corpses around the beach, and eventually Jill finds a vial of liquid inside one of them, possibly a new virus. Some of the beach blobs begin moving, and we have to fill them with bullets to bring them down. Once we gather enough data, we return to Clive. The results of the scan prove the corpses were infected with some sort of virus. Clive then gets a call telling him that Chris and Jessica have disappeared. This is how the whole mission started, and why Jill and Parker were sent to find them anyways. The game actually does this a lot. It bounces back and forth, sometimes giving us brief episodes in the past, sometimes they're necessary to establish the story, but other times they're just a bit random. As a general point of criticism, I do wish this game stayed aboard the ship for the entire entry. I think if it would have, it honestly could have been an amazing RE spin-off, but it bounces around so much, off the ship in present day to cover other characters, back in time to establish backgrounds, and it just leaves the main story on the ship not feeling as important as it could be. It also makes you just want to be back on the ship, because that's the really fun part of the game. We jump back to the ship, checking in again with Jill and Parker. We quickly find Chris tied to a chair in another room, and Jill is tasked with heading through the ship to find a key to this room. We weave through the bathrooms, bunks, and hallways, eventually coming across a door marked with an anchor, noting that this entry also has the classic themed keys that give us access to different areas of the main environment. We eventually stumble upon a woman being eviscerated by the ooze monsters. We can take them down, but we're too late to save her, so we just take the key instead. Opening to the door where Chris is trapped, we find out that this isn't Chris at all, but a dummy made to trap Jill and Parker in this room. The two are gassed, and a masked man shows up before our two heroes pass out. The next episode begins following Chris and Jessica as they are trekking through a snowy mountain. They're on a BSAA mission to find a Veltro camp on the other side of the peak. As they walk up the mountain, though, they see a plane crash off in the distance. It's pretty clear that they were carrying some sort of BOW or virus, though, based on the marks in the crash. Finding the manifest on the ship tells the two that Veltro was headed to Valkoinen Mock Airport. Chris and Jessica head into some nearby caves and are met with new resistance in that of the Fenrir, the dogs of this entry. They basically function like all the other dogs in Resident Evil. They make large, leaping attacks from a distance. And they are similarly deteriorating, bones sticking out from their sides, feral grins washed across their faces. During this cave section, Chris falls from a great height into a chasm below, and we're forced to defend ourselves against an onslaught of wolves while we wait for Jessica to get down safely. Outside, Jessica located the airport with her binoculars. Chris and Jessica get contacted by Clive, who reveals that he thinks they've been set up. See, the reveal here is that this is taking place in present time. We think it's before Chris and Jessica got lost, but actually, Clive received faulty intel that they were on the ship, so Jill and Parker are looking for them in the wrong place. Somebody sprung a trap, and we took the bait. Chris and Jessica notice the Veltro flag at the airport. It seems like they're the ones behind all of this. The two now have to head to the Mediterranean Sea to rescue Jill and Parker, turning things on their heads. Back on the ship, Jill and Parker have been separated and stored in two different rooms. We have to figure out a way to escape from here, which is honestly pretty simple. We grab a nearby screwdriver and use it to solve a panel puzzle. These puzzles are really the only ones included in the game, and they are exceedingly simple. We just have to move these little nodes to specific spots on the grid and make sure the wires don't get crossed. Luckily, there aren't too many of these over the course of the game, but because there's nothing else to fill in the gaps, it does leave you sort of wanting for a substantial puzzle. Since our weapons have been taken, we have to dodge enemies until we can get them back. One of these enemies whiffs on his attack and goes straight into a CRT. Navigating downstairs, we can reunite with Parker and get our weapons back. We also can access our first item box here where we can customize weapons. Our next goal on the ship, though, is to contact HQ and tell them what's happening on the ship. We have to head up a nearby elevator and take it to the bridge. Upstairs, we find out that the communications system has been broken, seemingly intentionally. The ship then begins to quake and the pair are attacked by a red-haired mystery assailant who aims a gun at them. We don't have to wonder who this mystery assailant is for long, though, because he pops up right at the beginning of the next episode. This episode begins with a flashback taking place during the Terra Grigia panic. Parker and Jill at this time were working for the FBC, and so was this red-haired man, Raymond. Morgan, the head of the FBC, is talking on the phone, but tells the crew to evacuate quickly. They're giving up the city. Clive confronts Morgan before we leave, telling him that the FBC is making a mistake by sacrificing Terra Grigia. Raymond heads off with the heads of their bureaus, and we head to the helicopter. In this stage, we have to move across various office buildings while fending off attacks from BOWs. These enemies are the standard hunter that we were introduced to all the way back in the first Resident Evil game. They're pretty quick, and instead of swaying around like the ooze, they actually jump all over the place, once again making them a more difficult target. We'll come back to Terra Grigia a couple times throughout the campaign, and these, in addition to the snowy chapters in the mountains outside of the airport, are definitely the action chapters of the game. For these brief periods, the game swaps its style from atmospheric horror aboard an abandoned seafaring vessel to fast-paced action fighting souped-up POWs. It's definitely a bit of tonal whiplash between the two, and while I would say that Revelations mostly tries its hand at returning the series to its horror roots, it can't help but dip its fingers into the modern action style of the time. These were probably my least favorite parts of the game, and like I said before, I usually just wanted to go back to the ship. I had keys to find, secrets to unlock, extra weapons to upgrade. Suddenly, I'm transported to Terra Grigia, and none of that really matters for a bit. In the context for the story, it does provide more background information. It does develop the characters more. It does create a more fleshed out world for this spin-off, but it also leaves the product feeling a bit all over the place. As Parker and Jessica escape the building and take the elevator to the helipad, they discuss how much this feels like Raccoon City. You know, with the whole nuking a city and everything. The two hop on the helicopter and we see a detailed cutscene of the destruction of Terra Grigia. It's actually one of my favorite cutscenes in the game. Buildings are crashing into one another, solar panels are crumbling under the heat, all while shining in the reflected sunlight. As Parker and Jessica ride away from the crumbling city, they remark how futile their efforts to help were. We then jump back to the present day on the Queen Zenobia. Parker realizes who Raymond is, so that whole "who are you" thing from the previous cutscene was just a fake out, I guess. He basically tells Jill and Parker that they're in over their heads. They don't know who they're fighting or why they're here. Even though Jessica now works for the BSAA with Chris, Raymond still works for the FBC, which is important to understand because he doesn't exactly seem like he's on our side at this point. Downstairs, we can find some memos, one specifically to the staff and the crew of the Zenobia. It seems like a sort of orientation document for the workers there, but it gives us a brief description of the various areas of the ship. The Gothic-style promenade hall, the card game and slot machine casino, a variety of restaurants and shops, and the solarium. And in the next room, we can find a document that lists the history of the ship. The Zenobia was part of the Paraguas line and was constructed in 1978. It was meant to replicate the golden age of cruise ships, and the design was actually based on blueprints left behind by George Trevor. If you don't remember, George Trevor was actually the architect behind the Spencer Mansion, and father to Lisa Trevor introduced in the RE1 remake. This is another example of Resident Evil attempting to throw in these little Easter eggs and connect games into the overall lore that's just kind of unnecessary. Also, I think it would have made more sense if one of the Travis family's blueprints were used, considering Travis Trading was a ship-based company in the 19th century. This memo also goes deeper into the meaning of the name Zenobia, referencing a queen of the Palmyrene Empire. Jill and Parker find a crest and a key down here, granting us access into further rooms upstairs, but also giving us the ability to get the shotgun, which has been locked up until now. With this new key, we can head into the Promenade Hall, a massive 4-story area that acts as a sort of crossroads to many different parts of the ship. Revelations, in its larger areas, uses these small sort of airlock rooms as loading screens. We enter one door quickly, and the second door takes a few extra seconds to load in the next area. It's certainly not the first game in the world to do this, but it was really cool to see a game like this do away with a lot of its loading screens. We can find access to the emergency communication room nearby, but we can't get in without the key, so we need to track down the comms officer who's nearby. Heading into the small cafeteria/shopping strip, we can hear the comms officer, who has been infected, but still makes his SOS calls throughout the echoing halls of the ship.
This is the Queen Zenobia. Emergency call number.
This was one of the moments in Revelations that actually surprised me with its atmosphere. We are essentially walking into a boss battle, and we know it, but the game alerts us to this with sound, a large focus for the development team behind the game. The boss itself is essentially one of the chainsaw enemies from previous games, but beefed up a bit. The comms officer, now mutated into a beast called a skaghead, is a large fat beast that scurries around and attempts to cut us up with its right-hand weapon. This is also probably the part of the game where we begin to notice the return of the gory death animations in the series. After defeating it, we can get access to the comm officer's key and his journal. His notes reflect the last days of his life as he slowly deteriorated into madness. Taking his key, we can head back to the promenade and get into the emergency comms room. Raymond is already here though, and the comms device is destroyed. The masked man that we saw before is giving some sort of manifesto on the screen. He claims to be a part of Veltro, and he wields a new virus called the T-Abyss virus. They are prepared to infect 1/5 of the Earth's water. He displays this virus and its incredible capability to turn fish into swimming beasts. Or as a character nicknamed Jackass puts it,
He's turning guppies into jaws.
the masked man reveals himself, but it's no one we've ever seen before. He seems to quote the Divine Comedy quite a lot. Because it's confirmed Veltro is behind all of this, Clive sends out 2 BSAA agents named Jackass and Grinder to head back to the airport that Chris and Jessica just left. Chris is with his partner on a helicopter searching for Jill and Parker, and he promises to find his old friend once again. The next episode begins as Raymond theorizes that Veltro is back because they want vengeance for what happened at Terra Grigia. The comms system here isn't working because the emergency power is on and it needs the main power to work, which honestly just seems like a terribly inefficient system to me. This means we need to head to the engine room and get the power back on. On the way out, Raymond gives us a key and talks about the fact that his partner, Rachel, has been lost somewhere in this ship. We'll deal with her later, but first we head through the casino in the ship. Here we can turn the power on, face some mutated fish jumping from the fountain, and play some slots to get enough coins to solve a puzzle that gets us in the VIP room. We find a large elevator nearby that will get us to the engine room, but we have to take another elevator back to where we entered the ship to get the key. It happens to be nearby the dead woman we found earlier, who turns out to be Rachel. Rachel has been infected though and has mutated into an incredibly difficult to defeat enemy. She is very fast, deathly strong, and hard to hit. We can actually kill her here to get the key, but she's sort of like a stalker enemy for this entry. I'm hesitant to call her a full stalker enemy because she doesn't follow us generally throughout the whole game. We'll just have certain segments where we can fight her again or avoid her entirely, and she never really dies. I guess she's more similar to something like Lisa Trevor than she really is to Mr. X. On our way to Rachel, we can actually re-enter the room where Jill and Parker were trapped earlier. We can find a memo called Mysterious Instructions that lists out tasks for some sort of team carrying out an expedition on the Queen Zenobia. They were wary of Jill and Parker arriving and didn't want them to interfere with the mission. They were meant to mislead us for some unknown reason and to not engage. Rebecca's memo that she left behind also noted that she didn't want to come on this mission. She figured out that the ship was used as a base of operations for the attack on Terra Grigia. We take out Rebecca, head back to Parker, and get the elevator working to head to the engine room. The next episode begins, and this is where the game starts to go off the rails a bit. And by that, I don't mean large, unrealistic monsters attacking us. I mean tonally. We jump over to two new characters, Jackass and Grinder. They're at the airport in the mountains looking for any sign or plans from Veltro. The whole tone of these characters is just way more comedic and funny than the rest of the game. Jackass is a big goof who really just kind of does whatever he wants and says anything that comes to mind. Grinder plays more of the straight man here, but the whole thing is just goofy. This is one of the downsides that comes with Revelations trying to make their game take on an episodic format. They include these characters that would probably work in a normal TV show, but here it just sort of detracts from the actual horror that's going down. Every time we jump back to Jill and Parker, we need time to get back into the horror, to sink into its depths and really understand what's going on, to shake off the goofy dust that's been scattered all over us from the previous sections. It also doesn't help that their chapters are mostly short and poorly paced, and not much really happens in them outside of the last one. On top of that, Jackass is revealed to be stalking Jessica right when we first meet this character, which, just makes him such a lovable and funny guy. The two break into a Veltro base, which is really just a short scattering of a couple hallways and 2 rooms. They find some footage of a plane taking off from the base. It was attacked by hunters before leaving, which is what took the plane down in Chris and Jessica's chapter. There's some other footage that shows an invisible BOW attacking people inside of the facility. We find a memo nearby from the dead soldier, and it's clear that he was completely indoctrinated into Veltro. Sacrifices, hounds of death, purging the world, all that neat stuff. The two eventually find a security token and need to head to the crash site of the ship to figure out where the freighter is. We then jump back to Jill and Parker on the ship. This whole area of the ship is flooded and the water is filled with new enemies. A breed of fish that jumps out of the water and attacks called the Gyozo, the same enemies we fought back in the casino fountain. And the sea creepers, a new blob that is far more sneaky in the flooding and manages to pop out almost instantly. This whole area of the ship is very industrial. It's the guts, the engine rooms, the soot-covered workplaces of the ones keeping the vehicle floating. This is in direct contrast to the lavish areas that we've been to thus far. The beautifully decorated promenade, the bright neon-lit casino awash with cash and high profits. It almost paints a picture of the ship itself, what it looked like when it was still functioning. This theme will slightly come back into play in the overall plot later. Down in the engine room, we have to solve a puzzle to get the engine working again. We can pull some levers that stop steam from coming out of the pipes, giving us access to different areas of the ship. Eventually, getting a cog and a key to start up the working engine again, we can activate the system. But this locks the doors and begins to flood the entire room. Jill and Parker are in serious danger. We then cut back to Clive at the BSAA headquarters. Jackass and Grinder are still looking for traces of Veltro in the mountains. We then go through the recycled crash site map that we already perused with Chris and Jessica. This time around, though, we fight the invisible BOWs that we saw before, which are just basically hunters that can go invisible. After defeating them, Jackass begins hacking the security terminal. They end up finding the coordinates for the ship, but they find out Veltro is looking for the ship as well, even though it's their own ship. Chris and Jessica are given the coordinates as well, meaning that they can head straight there and hopefully rescue Jill and Parker from drowning. Chris and Jessica arrive on the ship, and we have to weave through the hallways, retracing the path that Jill and Parker took. We end up fighting 2 skagheads in the casino, and as Chris and Jessica head down the elevator, we see Jill and Parker close to drowning in the engine room. They head through the same areas, now devoid of any of the flooding that we saw before, and when they get to the engine room, they find no flooding at all, not even Jill and Parker. It's at this time we realize Chris and Jessica are on a different ship. This is a pretty big reveal and a massive fake out. There will be some sort of explanation later, but for now, it's honestly just a good twist that really took me by surprise. I imagine a sequence where Chris and Jessica stop the water and these four characters are reunited, but the game decides to take a pretty decent swerve in the other direction. Back on the Zenobia, we have to swim through the water as Jill and collect some pipes so that we can open an escape grate for us to get out through. Parker and Jill are saved. They lower the ballast and finally get power to the ship, but there's one more problem. The antenna is out on the observation deck. It needs fixed, and that's our next mission. We then jump back to the other ship, the Queen Semiramis. They're still trying to locate the other ship at this point since they found the wrong one. Back aboard the Zenobia, Jill and Parker head towards the observation deck, but on their way up the elevator, they are assailed by a strange creature. It attacks with its tail and face, and we have not much to do but to shoot and stand in the elevator. This is not the whole boss battle though, because we meet it again on the way up. This is our first, sort of full boss fight with the creature called Droghignazo. This fight actually sort of feels like a legit Resident Evil boss battle. This creature has a massive shell on its back, meaning that we can't just damage it by firing willy-nilly. We have to target its exposed tissue, either on its stomach or what I guess you could call a head. I like the design of this boss, particularly because it's almost difficult to discern what we're even looking at here. This thing is so malformed and strange that it seems as if it was never human, or at least not of this earth. It really exemplifies that grotesque mutation theme that Resident Evil has always had. We have to avoid its massive charges, and using explosives can sometimes manage to stun it for long enough that we can attack its back. It's a nice boss fight because we honestly don't get many general boss fights throughout this whole game. They're pretty few and far between, but this one is decent. Once defeated, we can head upstairs to grab a Veltro keycard and a memo from a Veltro agent's journal. It's dated 2004 and talks about the leader of Veltro, Jack Norman, and his plan to purge humanity. Part of that plan was commandeering these two luxury cruise ships, what they saw as a symbol of excess in human society. Up top, Jill and Parker fix the antenna and are finally able to contact Clive. He tells them that the whole thing was a setup, but he won't answer our hero's questions. He gets a call from the ESF, who has reported satellite movement. The solar energy reintegrator that the FBC used to destroy Terra Grigia has been reactivated. It's being aimed straight for the Queen Zenobia. Clive seems to think that it's Morgan, for some reason, once again deciding to wipe evidence off the map. Clive tells the two that he doesn't have the time to rescue Jill or Parker. Chris is on his way to rescue them, but he won't get there in time, and Clive begins working on a way to stop the attack. Jackass radios in pretty quickly with a solution. He wants us to find a UAV aboard the ship, the same one that was used to spread the virus in Terra Grigia. We can use this to spread chaff that will confuse the satellite targeting system and hopefully prevent it from blowing us to hell. We make our way through the ship and head to the foredeck, where swarms of hunters have appeared. We have to fend them off to get the UAV up and running. Clive is then making a call to Morgan of the FBC. They seem to have some sort of feud going on, and Morgan basically confirms he's operating the satellite. He begins the activation of the solar device, but we only have 6 minutes to get to the remote UAV controls. This means a tense darting across the ship's outer deck, fighting against hunters and ooze along the way. We end up in a large cargo room, once again pursued by the infected Rachel and another skaghead. We get to the controls just in time though, and this does in fact confuse the satellite's targeting, but it still manages to hit near the ship, which causes the thing to capsize. Morgan tells Clive that he's trying to destroy the ship because he wants to get rid of the virus, ensuring that it's wiped out. Clive is determined to save the people on board the ship. Jill and Parker are swallowed up by the water in the ship, and we're forced to swim through the place, coming up for air every once in a while to make sure we don't drown. Chris contacts us as we're making our escape. He thinks that the ship crashing will make the virus infect the nearby oceans. Heading back through the entire ship, we need to rendezvous with Chris and Jessica, who have just arrived in the hall. The masked man appears in the casino before we can meet them, though. Before we can see the conversation, we jump back to Chris and Jessica driving a ship through the ocean and fighting off a massive parasite in the water in an on-rails mounted gun section. It's alright, though it's incredibly hard to aim this thing for some reason. It's also difficult to really hit anything, and the main point is really just to survive, because there's no killing it just yet. As Chris and Jessica reach the ship, we jump back to Jill and Parker. The masked man asks the group some questions. Why did it take Veltro so long to find the Queen Zenobia? How was it able to float around undetected? Why was Veltro able to vanish after the Terra Grigia panic undetected? And finally, why is someone using the solar device to destroy the ship? He seems like he's about to spill the beans on this mystery, but someone shoots him. It's Jessica, who has just showed up with Chris and mistaken this man as an assailant. The masked man is then revealed to be Raymond, seemingly a part of Veltro. He tells Parker to find the truth about Terra Grigia before dying. The group can't mourn him for long, though, because the ship starts to shift again. The party decides to split. Jill and Chris are heading to the ship's lab, and the other two, Parker and Jessica, are heading to stop the ship from sinking. One big criticism I have for RE Revelations is that it just tries to reuse so many areas of the game over and over again. Because of the episodic nature of the game, there is naturally a lot of linearity to the game's story. Of course, most of the time you can head back to previous areas and try to find any extras or things you've missed, but generally the game feels like it's putting you on a path. Therefore, it doesn't really feel like backtracking, but just reusing stretches of the game in a linear fashion. In the beginning half of the game, this is done pretty well, interconnecting parts of the ship in ways that you don't really expect, or, for example, the swimming sections. These see us trekking across the same areas of the game, but they are changed and viewed through a new lens. It's an efficient way to utilize environments, but the game is at its worst when it isn't doing that, when we're just heading down the same hallway that we already have, heading towards the same place that we've already been. I can't criticize it too much because it is already a pretty impressive feat that a game of this scope and fidelity was even pulled off on the 3DS in the first place. Backtracking through the facility, we eventually get access to the Veltro lab. We're introduced to a new enemy type here, a Scarmiglione, that uses a massive shield formed from its own body. We can destroy the top or bottom half of this thing, and then it turns into a wandering spine with legs. But if we manage to damage it evenly, we can actually just kill it with no issue. Chris and Jill get to the lab, revealing a large container of red liquid. After this serious big moment and reveal, we jump back to Jackass and Grinder. Grinder is freezing, waiting for Jackass to finish his hacking. The two head back to the airport because Jackass has made a realization, one that he doesn't want to say out loud just yet. This is basically the game just saving the reveal for a better point in time, most likely the end of the episode. We go through the same area as before, but this time there's a large warehouse at the end. We have to defend Jackass while he hacks, and once he's done, he's cracked the big conspiracy behind it all. He reveals that Clive O'Brien is the one that brought back Veltro. Technically, Veltro was never really back. It was an illusion orchestrated by Clive to get back at Morgan for what he did at Terra Grigia. They're trying to send Clive some information, but as it's sending, the whole airport is hit by a bombing run, taking out the two goofs in a blaze of glory. Back at the lab, Jill and Chris realize they're surrounded by the T-Abyss virus. We have to get deeper into the lab, past the pesky laser fences that currently block our way. We can't actually see these lasers unless we touch them, or if we use the Genesis. This is actually the only time in the entire game that the Genesis is used for a puzzle, and it's a really good implementation of this new gadget. I really wish they would have done more stuff like this because it was a moment that the game really started to shine for me, albeit very briefly, but it still happened. But it was just so shocking that they never really used this device outside of the general scanning and this section. After we get through the lasers, we can start to comb through some nearby memos that, as all Resident Evil lab sections do, start to clear things up a bit. The T-Abyss virus was created, shockingly, out of the Abyss virus and the T-Virus. The liquid form of the virus could, if dispersed into the water, contaminate the entire world's oceans very quickly. Jill heads upstairs alone, tries to synthesize a cure, but also to get a password that Chris needs to access a terminal. Up here, we can see the floating tentacles in the water outside the lab. She finds a very important memo on the body of a dead worker, though. It reveals that Morgan, the head of the FBC, was behind the original attacks on Terra Grigia. He gave Veltro the virus, then used the data from the virus's spread, and eventually covered up the evidence of the attacks by destroying the entire city. After Jill gets the password, the chamber is flooded and she swims back downstairs. As they begin to neutralize the virus, though, Morgan contacts them only to say that he plans to kill them and further erase any evidence of his misdeeds. We fend off the virus from hordes of infected, and once the virus is fully neutralized, he gives his villain monologue. He shows them footage of the ship that they're on, clearly planning to take them out. We then jump back to Jessica and Parker, playing Parker as the two try to stop the ship from sinking. Jessica pretty quickly leaves, though, as she has something to check on first, not suspicious at all. By the time we get to the bridge, though, Jessica is already there messing with stuff. Parker has already correctly determined that she's the spy, trying to affect the ship's self-destruct. Raymond then shows up again, somehow revealing he's alive and on our side. Parker doesn't fully trust Raymond, though, and this gives Jessica enough time to shoot Parker and activate the self-destruct. Parker tells Raymond to go after her as he bleeds out on the bridge. The ship then begins to explode in a fiery blaze, but it's once again revealed that this is actually the Queen Semiramis. There are just way too many fake outs like this in the game. I liked it the first time, but it honestly happens so much more than just the two ships twists. Like the time when Parker claims he doesn't know who Raymond is at the end of a chapter, only for him to, moments later, realize that it's Raymond. Was it dark in there or what? Because the game has this episodic format, it feels the need to end every chapter with a huge cliffhanger, even if it doesn't work there. And it gets to the point where you stop trusting the story because you know that it's actively lying to you. Regardless, Jessica has set the self-destruct on the Queen Zenobia, so that means we need to escape the ship. Chris and Jill head back through the lab as the ship is exploding around them. We find Parker on the way, who is not dead yet. We have to carry him throughout the halls to try and save our new partner, but eventually a catwalk collapses and Parker is falling into the fire below. Chris and Jill are unable to lift him up and he falls into the blaze. Chris and Jill continue their escape with only 5 minutes left on the timer. This means we have another countdown to contend with. We walk up the side of the ship as barrels and crates start crashing down onto us. I absolutely could not make it through this section without getting hit. On the deck, the pilot is disrupted as a giant infected beast pops out of the ship. We have to defeat this thing so that the chopper can land and take us out of here. The first part of this battle sees us shooting the limbs popping out of the monster's body. The pilot will send us down rocket launchers every once in a while to make this a bit easier. We also have to avoid their piercing attacks as they make contact with what is left of the deck. Upon defeating it, Chris and Jill escape on the helicopter, but the beast reveals it's still alive. We have to finally take it down with an on-rails shooting section. During this section, the helicopter flies around the monster while we target the massive parasites wriggling their way out of this thing. I mostly like this boss battle, and I like it more in retrospect. At the time, I thought it was the final one, but it turns out we'll get a sort of true Resident Evil final boss later. This boss does set the stage, though, and even though it leans very far into the action camp, it does properly reflect this era of the series of games. It wasn't anything amazing, but it wasn't bad either. After we shoot this thing for like 10 minutes, the chopper launches a rocket at its head, finally finishing it off, leaving its corpse slumped in the remains of the Queen Zenobia. Chris and Jill update Clive on what happened. They ask him to come clean about everything. We get a flashback at this point to Terra Grigia. We're playing Parker and Jessica again as they're trying to find the command room, swarmed by hunters in the falling city. On the way, we find Raymond, who we also have to save by carrying him through the facility. He's shot, so we have to get him a med kit, which means backtracking through the place we just went through and through the areas that we went through in the last flashback to Terra Grigia. Once we get the med kit, Parker saves Raymond's life. The three make their way up the elevator, and Raymond begins to question how Veltro pulled off an attack like this in the first place. He was already suspicious. We eventually get to the command room, which links this flashback up with the other one we saw previously, where Parker, Jessica, and Raymond are waiting for evacuation orders from Morgan. This time, though, we see a conversation that Morgan was having on the phone. He's talking to Norman, the real head of Veltro, giving him the bad news that his resistance is over. But Norman already has blackmail on Morgan. He threatens to release all of the information he has that proves Morgan was behind this attack. We then jump back to present day on the collapsing Zenobia. Parker and Raymond are in the guts of the ship. Parker somehow survived the flames, but Raymond decides to save him, just like Parker did for him back in Terra Grigia. Back in the chopper, Clive reveals that he and Raymond were working together. They orchestrated the revival of Veltro, all to try and implicate Morgan for what he did in Terra Grigia. Clive reveals that Jackass and Grinder found evidence of a third ship before they died. Back at the BSAA, the organization is being taken over by the FBC, and they're arresting Clive. The final episode of the game takes place in the ruins of the final Veltro ship, the Queen Dido. Chris and Jill move their way through the ruined underwater halls of the boat. Moving through the ship, we'll eventually find the remains of dead FBC and Veltro soldiers, a lot of them martyred for their cause. This culminates in us finding a video of Norman, who was planning to infect himself with the T-Abyss virus to try and carry out the original plan for his resistance. He had a blood feud with Morgan at this point because of the man's betrayal. Chris and Jill's goal is to find Norman's blackmail information on Morgan, but Norman is still alive in the next room and infects himself once again. He becomes our final boss battle of this game, a massive tyrant-like creature. This boss is actually pretty hard because somehow Norman can teleport around this arena with the glowing third eye on his head. I think technically he's actually using this light on his head to blind us and then burning some sort of image into our heads to make it seem like he's teleporting, but I'm not sure. The first few stages of the battle, we have to wait for Norman to teleport, and when he goes to attack, his heart opens. We can damage this heart to take more health off the boss. Using a shotgun on the heart also stuns him out of attacking, which is very helpful because Norman does a ton of damage. He'll also create copies later in the fight, and we have to wait for the heart to open on the real one and do the same thing. Towards the end of the fight, Norman gets sort of charged up and just starts slashing much quicker, but the goal is still the same, to hit his heart. It's actually a pretty difficult boss battle, but I honestly really enjoyed it. It felt like a good, souped-up twist on the classic Resident Evil tyrant fight that the series is known for. And it even makes in-world sense, since the T-Abyss virus is part T-virus in the first place. Also, Norman kind of looks like a fish, so T-virus plus water virus, tyrant fish. After Norman is killed, Jill and Chris pick up the blackmail evidence on Morgan, which includes a video of him giving direct orders to Norman to spread the virus and attack Terra Grigia. This footage is released to the BSAA, and this prevents Clive from being arrested. In fact, Morgan is actually arrested. Jill and Chris then get their idyllic ending on the helicopter as they fly away into blue skies. We then get some end credits cards that tell us what happened after the game ends. The FBC was dissolved, and many of its agents went to the BSAA, creating the organization that we see in Resident Evil 5. We see a short cutscene that shows Jackass and Grinder somehow survived. Parker, who also survived, is struggling to read a book, and Clive decided to step down from his position as head of the BSAA. Chris and Jill are shown heading up to the Spencer estate, the place where they would have their confrontation with Wesker in Resident Evil 5. Now, I have a lot to say about this game and its story overall, but before I talk about that, I just need to briefly talk about this game's Mercenaries mode, which is called Raid Mode. Raid mode is given a new name in this entry because it is very unique in the line of Mercenaries minigames, to the point that it almost doesn't resemble the previous ones from the series. Instead of fighting enemies off and gaining more time on a countdown, we speedrun through levels, killing enemies along the way. It's more similar to something like RE Village's Mercenaries mode, except that we don't gain combo or time from killing enemies, so there isn't as much of a reliance on spawn points. Each level is essentially a short part of the main game, where we run through, killing enemies as fast as we can, and trying to get the goal in as little time as possible. For completing each level, we get BP, a currency that we can use to buy new weapons, weapon attachments, refill consumables, etc. We also get experience, and our level determines how much damage we'll do or can take. Each stage has a recommended level to complete it. We can gain extra BP on each stage by getting through the level without getting hit, killing all the enemies in the level, and by having our level lower than the recommended for the stage. If we manage to get all 3 of these bonuses on one level, we get a Trinity bonus, which gives us even more extra BP. You can adjust and change your level back to previous ones at any time, so you don't have to worry about out-leveling a mission. Certain stronger enemies will drop new weapons or attachments for those weapons, and there is so much customization to be done here. We can change the character that we're playing and their outfit, each of which gives a variety of different modifiers like extra damage with specific weapons or increased reload speed. Each weapon also has different variations. There are stronger and more rare assault rifles, magnums, and shotguns that you can get just from buying them with BP or from randomly picking them up in the world. The same thing goes for weapon attachments, and there's way more variety to all of this in raid mode than there was in the main campaign. Also, every level has 2 higher difficulty variations that can be unlocked after beating the first set of them. There's just so much to this game, and I genuinely feel like you could put 30 hours into it at least, just to get everything. It's incredibly addicting too. Adding these light RPG elements to a Resident Evil Mercenaries game is just such a genius idea, because it introduces so many different progression systems. I had a ton of fun while I was playing it, and I honestly didn't want to stop to keep working on this video because I just wanted to unlock more stuff in this mode. That being said, the minigame itself is pretty grindy, and a lot of that time does come from the fact that you're going to have to grind a ton to get the required levels to beat all of the stages. It's not classic JRPG grindy, but you're definitely going to be repeating levels over and over again. And that grind doesn't come from challenge, it just comes from raw numbers. You also might have to go back and grind previous levels to get the BP required to keep purchasing ammunition after every round, because it doesn't refill on its own and it can be expensive depending on the gun that you're using. Because of that, I don't know if it exactly stacks up with something like Resident Evil 4 Remake or 5's Mercenary mode, but it's still really good, and I would put it down as one of my favorites. Revelations as a whole is a decent game, but it's not everything I wanted it to be. In marketing and interviews, the game puts itself out there as an ode to the classic games in the series, a return to form, a homecoming to the horror genre. And that's not a lie, in some ways. Certain stages of the game are exactly what they claim to be. They are atmospheric and tense, they're fun, the mystery is interesting and keeps you going forward, but other stages just leave you feel like you're playing one of the mainline entries from the time, but on a handheld system. The reason I like Revelations and don't love it is because it did have a lot of potential, and playing it is a bit of a letdown compared to how the game seems from the outside. The marketing, the interviews, hell, even the box design gives you a certain impression. The game you get is a bit different from that impression, and that's okay, but it doesn't always work. The story is also a little more than all over the place. Cram-packed with a ton of new characters, new lore and background events, it feels like there's a whole world here, and maybe its story is just a bit too ambitious for its 6-hour runtime. Jessica is a pretty central figure to the whole story here. She's working for the FBC, and she turns out to be the mole that Morgan has in the organization. She's the reason that things really start to go belly up at the end. But that being said, we rarely get any insight for her motivations outside of one flashback mission that vaguely hints towards things. This is, of course, rectified in the last cutscene from the game when it's revealed that both Raymond and Jessica are working for Tricell behind the scenes. This sort of explains things, but not really. Was she just getting the virus? What did Tricell want her to do there? Raymond is in a similar camp, a double, triple, whatever agent working for multiple people. Parker is probably the most contextualized character out of the new group. He clearly cares for the people he's working with. He cares for Jill and Chris, and even went incredibly far to save Raymond in Terra Grigia. That act of kindness saved his own life further down the line. But don't even get me started on Jackass and Grinder. Grinder is basically a nothing character, just meant to play the straight man to Jackass's weird, nerdy stalker jokes. Jackass himself is classic hacker bro, and it doesn't really go anywhere beyond that. They do things that affect the story, they advance the plot and help out, but the characters themselves feel like they could have been switched out with anyone and it wouldn't matter. Morgan and Clive are sort of interesting. They have this feud going on that essentially fuels the entire narrative, but a lot of their interactions just boil down to, I got you backed in a corner, and then the other guy says, actually, I did something you would never expect, and then we get a big twist. Norman is sort of the ultimate antagonist of the game, though Morgan is definitely a bigger antagonist. Norman is the actual last one we fight, but he's barely in the game at all. He just is kind of this background character, and then he appears at the end, and he's our final boss. Jill and Chris themselves are fine. They're just the normal characters we've already seen before. But the whole thing just feels off, and it's never really quite clear what's going on. This is kind of one of the big issues with making complex plots in a Resident Evil game. The series has always been pretty simple. Get too convoluted and it just doesn't fit with the series. Other games are convoluted, but normally just in their finales or explanations for previous events. Generally, when you boil it down, they're all pretty simple tales. With Revelations, we're dealing with two national organizations and a resistance organization, but the resistance organization is being controlled by one of the other national organizations, and actually, the resistance organization reappearing is the other national organization. It's just so incredibly odd, and it never really carries any weight with the new complexity that it brings. The gameplay itself is generally fine, and the whole package is pretty impressive when you realize the game came out on the 3DS. It's definitely one of the better games in the action era of Resident Evil, and I would take this over 6 any day of the week. But it's for all these reasons that I can't say that I love Resident Evil Revelations. I just kind of like it, and that's okay. The game was a general success with critics and fans alike. The game currently has an 82 out of 100 on Metacritic, with most outlets praising the blend of genres and the fact that it was a great handheld title. The game sold well, especially for a 3DS game, but Capcom wasn't incredibly impressed with its numbers. The game had a pretty high budget, so they were hoping they could get just a little more out of it. That didn't stop them from making a sequel on the same system, though. But we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to give me a like, subscribe, let me know in the comments what you thought about Resident Evil Revelations. If you want to further support the channel, then go to the description and subscribe to the Patreon. I've been reviewing the Resident Evil movies exclusively over there. You can't find them anywhere else, and it's been a pretty good time. You'll also get to join this list of amazing people here that I just want to say thank you to. We're almost done with the Resident Evil series. I think pretty soon, before that finishes though, you're probably going to see a Death Stranding 2 video, because that one has been a large task, but it is nearing its end. So expect that relatively soon. And Resident Evil Revelations 2 is coming, and the Outbreak games as well, before the whole series is wrapped up and finished and we move on to something else. But that'll be for next time. I will see you soon. Bye, Dad.